Hi, this is Professor Kahan Lust, and this is History 1301, U.S. History 2, 1877. Welcome back for Lecture 10 in this semester. It is Jefferson, the War of 1812, and its aftermath. Now, in our last class, remember that we were dealing with Thomas Jefferson and his war on the judiciary. That's what we closed with. And the two things that came out of this war, if you will, on the judiciary were two principles that Jefferson had wanted nothing to do with that he inadvertently created. And those two principles were the principle of judicial review, which had the effect of expanding the power of the judiciary. Jefferson hated the judiciary and wanted nothing to do with the expansion of their power. And secondly, he sort of ushered in this idea of independent judiciary thought. Because of his actions in successfully removing John Pickering from the courts and the attempt to remove Samuel Chase from the United States Supreme Court, it solidified in many people's minds the need for the federal judiciary to be above the din of politics. Now, the point overall is that the Jeffersonian era was one of conflict, not just divergent political philosophies, but a conflict of idealism and ideals within Jefferson himself. Now, the next area where we see this is in the first thing that affects Jefferson in this particular lecture, and that is going to be the Louisiana Purchase. In April of 1803, Jefferson, in a way, quote, broke the law. If he were thinking about himself, thinking of others, he would have looked at this and said, this is an overreach by the federal government. Jefferson acquired 800,000 square miles of territory from Napoleon Bonaparte of France for $15 million. And the story of how Jefferson acquired this territory is interesting for what it revealed about Jeffersonian ideals and even about Europe and its ideas about race in the New World. Now, Napoleon Bonaparte, we've mentioned him in this class before. He had these massive ambitions after the French Revolution about creating a new empire for France. And a big part of this new empire hinged on the New World. And for the New World, Napoleon understood he needed two things to help foster that. He needed control of the Gulf Coast region, the area that we in the Houston Community College system live in. That's the Gulf Coast region, and he needed to reestablish control of Haiti. Now, you may recall that back in the French and Indian War, 7 Years' War, that France had surrendered the Louisiana Territory to Spain to prevent that from falling into English hands. So Spain is now in control, quote unquote, of the Gulf Coast. Once Napoleon came into power in France, he basically forced the Spanish to give it up at gunpoint. He basically threatened war with them, and Spain decided it would be better to just give it to him. Now, he doesn't just literally take it from them. He gives them a token payment for it. But Spain decides it's not worth fighting with Napoleon Bonaparte over. Now, the bigger problem is going to be Haiti. Remember, Haiti had previously been the wealthiest colony in the world, courtesy of the massive amount of sugar grown there, the massive number of enslaved people there, and it was, again, it's slightly more important to Napoleon's plans. So Napoleon put a ton of energy into reconquering Haiti and restoring slavery to the island. Now, to do this, Napoleon winds up sending one of his best generals to Haiti to accomplish this task, and he tells him to use all means at his disposal to do this, and Napoleon trusted this guy. It was his brother-in-law, so he's thinking he's got the guy to handle all of this. In 1802, France was on the verge of success. They had captured Haiti's revolutionary leader, a guy named Toussaint L'Ouverture. They had confined him to a castle in the French Alps and basically left him there to die, to freeze to death. They were gaining victory after victory after victory over the Republicans in Haiti, small r Republicans, meaning people dedicated to the idea of a Haitian republic. And everything looked like Haiti was about to fall apart here. But then an enormous yellow fever epidemic virtually wiped out the French army. Napoleon became convinced that Haiti was no longer worth the cost. In fact, in the middle of all of this stuff, Napoleon is alleged to have said, quote, damn sugar, damn coffee, and damn colonies. He was tired of all of this stuff. Without Haiti, without being able to bring them into the fold, Napoleon had really very little interest in the New World and very little interest in Louisiana. So he kind of started looking around for a buyer. On top of this, Napoleon also needed money because he's embroiled in this massive continent-wide war. He's not just in fighting Great Britain now. He's fighting everybody along the continent of Europe. So he's constantly in need of money. He's desperate for money. Now, Jefferson, remember, is generally speaking pro-French in his orientation about foreign policy. But Jefferson generally believed that Napoleon was bad for France. And he looked at this and said, this is our chance to get something, especially if Napoleon is going to take the entirety of the Louisiana Territory, represented on this slide as the Louisiana Purchase territory. Jefferson's looking at this whole swath of land and saying, if Napoleon gets all of this, this is very bad. So what Jefferson originally planned to do, after Napoleon took over all of this stuff from Spain, he sends James Madison, his Secretary of State, and another envoy to France and tells them that they should buy as much territory in the Gulf Coast region as they could for $2 million. Now, what they're really talking about is, if you look down at the southernmost point of this, what they're really focused on is the Orleans territory. That's what Jefferson really wants. He doesn't really care about the rest of the Louisiana territory. He's thinking strictly about port access to the Mississippi River. So as he's doing this, as Madison is negotiating with the French government, this all is happening. It's coinciding with these French defeats in Haiti. So Napoleon, as the story goes, in a fit of rage, told Madison the United States could have everything, all of the all of the Louisiana Purchase territory, which would mean control of the entire Mississippi River, for $15 million. Now, think about what Madison's mind is going through. He's been told to spend $2 million to essentially buy the port of New Orleans, this tiny little amount of territory down at the southernmost tip of the Louisiana Purchase territory. And now he's being told by Napoleon, I'll let you have all of Louisiana, everything all the way up to the Canadian border. I'll let you have all of that for $15 million. Madison doesn't even think twice about this. Madison's thinking is Napoleon is prone to these outbursts. We need to agree to this, write it up, and get out of here before Napoleon changes his mind. Now, this is an important thing. This treaty is important. It doubles the size of the United States. You can see by looking at the next slide, or at this slide, this picture on the left-hand side is essentially the United States territory up until the Louisiana Purchase. So the Louisiana Purchase does literally double the size of the United States, but it's also a problem here. And Madison knows it's a problem. Madison knows he has wildly exceeded his authority, but he also is aware that there is nothing in the Constitution that actually allows the president or the executive branch to independently acquire territory. So what he's done is, in effect, extra legal. Okay, means there's not a law against it, but there's nothing that provides for it. So for a strict constructionist like Thomas Jefferson, this is a real problem. If it's not in the Constitution, remember, a strict constructionist says, if it's not in the Constitution, you can't do it. But Madison believed that the benefits were obviously something that outweighed the potential crisis. And when Jefferson sees this, Jefferson also comes to the conclusion that, well, if push comes to shove, we'll argue to the Senate that the benefits outweigh this potential problem. Now, it turned out not to really be an issue because Congress also understood that the benefits outweigh any sort of potential crisis. So Jefferson kind of skated on this one. But this isn't the end of problems associated with the Louisiana Purchase. Why this is problematic internally in the United States has nothing to do with the purchase. It's got nothing to do with whether this is something that's extra legal or strict constructionist versus broad constructionist. It's who's going to remain in power in the United States. And the problem is this. If we look at what the country looks like at the right before the Louisiana Purchase, the Federalists are generally in control in the northeastern parts of the United States, what we call today, we would call New England. They're very strong as a political force in New York. They're somewhat strong in New Jersey, in Pennsylvania. While the Democratic Republicans or the Republicans predominate in the South, and they kind of share Pennsylvania. There's a few Federalists in the South, and there's a few Democratic Republicans in the North. But they're kind of split along these lines. The Federalists, unquestionably, though, are dominant in New England. And they look at what the new country is going to be like. They say, we're going to undoubtedly carve out a number of new states from that Louisiana Purchase that we've just made from France. And these new states, when they're created, even the Northwest Territories, you can see here in the middle of the map, they're looking at that and going, there is no way that those states are going to be Federalist in nature. Those states that come out of the Northwest Territory and then later on the Louisiana Purchase Territory, they are almost all going to be Democratic Republican dominated states because the Democratic Republicans tend to favor the interests of farmers as opposed to the merchant class, while the Federalists tend to favor the interests of the merchant class over those of farmers. Shippers and manufacturers predominate in the Federalist Party. So looking at this, the Federalists concluded our time in controlling this country or having any real say in this country is almost to an end. As soon as those new states come in, we're going to mean much, much less to this country. So they decide simply, we're out. We're going to secede from the United States. So this first argument about our power is less important now, or our power means less. The first argument that happens so we secede doesn't come out of the South, it comes out of New England. And it's the New England states that get together that form something that they call the Northern Confederacy. This Northern Confederacy is the states of Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Vermont, Rhode Island. All of them are part of this. But they also thought they'd really like to have New York. Now, they weren't sure how they were going to get New York, but the opportunity actually kind of fell into their laps. Aaron Burr was the vice president of the United States, and heading into 1804, Aaron Burr had kind of come to the conclusion, I'm never going to be treated with any sort of respect. My counsel is never going to be sought, so it's better for me to leave the federal branch, the executive branch, and go home to New York. I'll run for governor of New York. So the Federalists in places like Massachusetts, in Rhode Island, in Connecticut, and indeed in New York, come to Aaron Burr and say, look, you're running for governor of New York. We'd like to come up with some sort of a deal with you. We'd like you to come out in support of this secession plan and lead New York out of the Union to have it join the Northern Confederacy. So everything is predicated on New York. The sitting governor of New York said, I don't want anything to do with this, refused to endorse the plan. So Burr is their next best hope. So Aaron Burr thinks about it and as Aaron Burr frequently did, said, "What's in it for me?" And finally, the leaders of the Northern Confederacy tell Burr, if you win, and New York does in fact secede, and join the Northern Confederacy, we will name you president of the Northern Confederacy. So for Aaron Burr, he's thinking this is great because he's thinking he's going to win in New York. The idea that he might lose is just incomprehensible to him. So he's thinking, I'm going to go from being vice president of the United States, a position that I don't like, that I'm not respected in, and I'll parlay that into being governor of New York. Almost immediately after being governor of New York, I'll be named the president of this new country, the Northern Confederacy. I'll take it, he says. And he goes in and he joins up with this movement. But what Aaron Burr did not count on was that there was a faction of Federalists, particularly in New York, who were very much against the Northern Confederacy. And one of those men was Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton, as we've talked about, he was Washington's chief of staff during the Revolutionary War. He was a very important military figure during the Revolutionary War. And paraphrasing what Hamilton said on all of this stuff essentially was, I didn't fight the war so that we could secede the first time we don't like something about the government. So Aaron Burr is running for government with the backing, for the most part, of the Federalist Party on a national standing, while the guy associated with the Federalist Party, Alexander Hamilton, is saying, for God's sake, don't vote for that guy. So Hamilton uses all of his political influence, all of his clout, to make sure that Aaron Burr loses this gubernatorial election. And when the election happens, Burr loses. And Burr is furious about this. Aaron Burr just flat out loses it over the way Hamilton treated him, over the things Hamilton was saying in print about him, which amounted to, the guy's untrustworthy, he's a snake, don't believe anything he says, all of that sort of stuff. He has no morals. Forget no morals, he doesn't even have a compass that would point him in the right direction. So Burr takes this very personally. And a lot of times when people say, well, they took it personally and they shouldn't have taken it personally. Burr took it personally because it was personal. Everything Hamilton said about him was personal. And you probably all know how this plays out. Burr winds up challenging Alexander Hamilton to a duel because of this stuff. They go across the river into New Jersey, and Aaron Burr's pistol, the original story about this duel was that Burr's pistol misfired. Hamilton's pistol misfired. Burr's pistol did not. However, there's a ton of evidence from the written record, from the stories of their seconds and all this stuff, that suggests that maybe Hamilton planned to fire in the air, and that's why it appeared to be a misfire. But either way, what's indisputable is that Aaron Burr is still the vice president of the United States at this point, by the way. What's indisputable is that Aaron Burr has just killed the leader of the opposition party. He's a Democratic Republican in name only. Alexander Hamilton is Mr. Federalist, and Aaron Burr just killed him. The vice president of the United States kills the guy who's the opposition leader and a former secretary of the Treasury. And Burr realizes, even though he's gained his satisfaction, he's avenged the insult against him, he also, it's one of those things where you do something and you feel really good, and then you start thinking about it and going, oh my God, what did I just do? That's where Aaron Burr is. And Aaron Burr flees. Now, this fleeing is what causes him to get into his next problem. And this also directly involves Thomas Jefferson and the federal government. When Burr runs off, he flees out west, where he meets up with an old friend of his, the military governor of the territory of Louisiana. Now, this guy's name was James Wilkinson. James Wilkinson was the highest ranking military officer in the United States Army, and by virtue of his commanding the Department of the South, that's a department in the Army, by virtue of his command of the Department of the South, he was the military governor of Louisiana. So Burr, knowing Wilkinson, kind of gets together with him and says, "Look, I kind of need you to hide me." He doesn't literally say that, so don't go looking for it in any records. But that's essentially what Burr is telling him. Uh, and while he's there with Wilkinson, they get to talking, and Aaron Burr comes up with this plan. Now, to what extent Burr really probably could have put this into action, to what extent uh, Burr was being serious about this, and to what extent Wilkinson is actually involved in it, nobody really knows, because the two were smart enough not to directly write letters and to correspond about it. But in piecing together letters from various British officials, piecing together letters that Burr sent to people in England looking for support, historians have pieced this whole narrative together about something that is now known as the, quote, Burr conspiracy. And very simply, what Aaron Burr was planning to do was to steal or separate part of the United States' territory from the federal government and create an empire for himself as a king. Now, what the plan, this whole part of this being an empire, the plan is he's going to say, we're going to separate everything west of the Appalachian Mountains and give it back to Great Britain. And Great Britain, in return, will give him this little plot of land that will be his kingdom. Now, unquestionably, Wilkinson knows about this because Burr is talking to him on a daily basis. He's there essentially under the protection of James Wilkinson. And when Burr starts putting this plan into action, he sends various people in England, people he knew, because remember, he's the vice president of the United States, and he's only just now been removed from that by virtue of running off. He sends letters to people asking for $500,000 in loans so that he can actually finance this mission, and for British naval assistance. In return, he's going to steal all of this territory and give it back. Now, this plan seems on some level to be kind of crazy. The British don't know whether to take it seriously or not. So they tell Burr, through various emissaries, the British government tells Burr, let's meet up, we will inspect your troops, and we'll decide if we want to proceed from there. So they meet. Where they meet has been lost to history. Unfortunately, nobody talked about it in the letters and all of this. But Burr meets with these emissaries, and when Burr shows up, he shows up with a grand total of 60 men. So Burr had it in his head. It's either a miscommunication that Burr thought maybe I just bring my military staff, or he had it in his head that he was going to conquer everything west of the Appalachian Mountains with 60 men, with England doing the bulk of the heavy lifting. Needless to say, Great Britain told him, forget it. These emissaries told him, basically, we're not interested. But what they also do in the interim is they tell Thomas Jefferson through the State Department. They don't tell him what Burr is doing necessarily, but they say, it's come to our attention that Aaron Burr, your former vice president, might be involved in this plot, and the details are sketchy, but it seems like he's trying to steal American territory. What the hell's going on here? And so Burr he's now been double-crossed by England on some level. Jefferson puts a plan in motion to get Burr out of the picture completely. He sends out all of these orders without specifically attacking Wilkinson, but issues this order saying, if you're harboring the fugitive, Aaron Burr, I want him returned. You're going to be subject to all sorts of problems up to and including court-martial if you don't hand him over. Now, Wilkinson probably, because again, Wilkinson didn't write any of this stuff down, Wilkinson probably looks at this and says, okay, it's time to cut my losses and get rid of this guy. So as soon as Burr comes back from this meeting that he's had with the British, James Wilkinson orders him to be arrested and transported back to Washington, D.C. When he's back in Washington, D.C., Jefferson demands that he stand trial for treason against the United States. The presiding judge in the case is the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, John Marshall. And John Marshall rules in Burr's treason case that in order to prove acts of treason to be legitimate, the charge must be accompanied with the statements from two eyewitnesses. And Jefferson simply couldn't produce two eyewitnesses. The only two real eyewitnesses to this were probably Burr, who was not going to incriminate himself, and James Wilkinson, who was saying, I'm not involved in this, because again, if Wilkinson says, I know about all of this stuff, here's what Burr was doing, then he implicates himself too. So nobody's going to say, we were involved in this. So it winds up all coming down to nothing, and Burr winds up being acquitted. But for what it's worth, his career in the U.S. government is over. Nobody's going to trust him. Burr will wind up being very successful in business, but as far as any sort of political office, not a chance for him. Now, in 1804, Thomas Jefferson wins a second term as president of the United States. And just like every other president after him, his presidency seemed to go right to hell in a handbasket in that second term. Now, at the very beginning, everything looked okay. He could say at the start of a second term, he could say, I doubled the size of the country with the Louisiana Purchase. Courtesy of what we've done with ferreting out the Burr conspiracy, I've gotten rid of Aaron Burr from the government. I've also stopped the Northern Confederacy. So the plan of splitting the country apart through the Northern Confederacy, that's also been dealt with. So everything looks good for him. But for the second time in the last decade, the United States once again gets caught in the middle of a war between the French and the British. And just like in the 1790s, the United States believed that they could trade with both sides. They could trade with both Britain and France, declare neutrality, and say, hey, don't mess with us. We are not a part of this stuff. Now, again, the British and the French are seizing American vessels. They're both engaging in impressment, again, where they seize American sailors and force them to serve in that country's own navy. Now, I've got it on the slide here that it's forcing these guys to serve in the British Navy. The British are the ones who are doing this far more than the French are. So impressment comes to be associated with the British, which is why I've associated it with the British here on the slide. Now, why they're both attacking American shipping and why they're both doing all of this is both sides, the British and the French, are at a stalemate, which means they can't push one side or the other back. They're just kind of running into each other, and neither side has the advantage. And there's a very simple reason why. The British have naval superiority. The French have land army superiority. So both of those things wind up canceling each other out. So both Great Britain and France have concluded that the path to victory is in whoever controls trade with the United States. Trade with the United States will mean the margin of victory. So this is why they're both doing this. Now, throughout the early parts of this stuff, the British could actually point to Jay's Treaty and say, hey, we have a treaty that allows us to do all of these things. Absent the impressments, yeah, we can't do that. But all of this other stuff, the stopping the ships, the seizure of cargoes, we're allowed to do this under Jay's Treaty. The French have no such treaty. So, Jefferson is kind of in the middle of a nasty situation, made worse by something called the Chesapeake Leopard Affair, where a vessel, the United States Chesapeake, is actually stopped by a British war vessel, the HMS Leopard, and in full view of the American coastline, the Chesapeake is fired upon, it's boarded, its cargo is seized, 4 men are actually impressed, and I think it's 13 men were killed. It doesn't really matter how many died. But this is that it's all happening in full view of the coastline, in full view of Americans, is something that makes Americans say something has got to be done about this. So finally, in 1807, Jefferson convinces Congress to pass something called the Embargo Act. It's the Embargo Act of 1807. Now, Jefferson, on some level, is an idealist. He wanted to maintain trade with both, but he decided if I can't maintain trade with both, I'll just cut both of them off. Now, the embargo of 1807 does not specifically say we're doing this to hurt Great Britain and France, but there's no question, geopolitically, it's aimed at Great Britain and France. But so that it does not appear that way, it's written in such a way that the embargo calls for a general embargo, meaning we're not trading with anybody right now. Jefferson thinks both of these countries are going to say, oh, well, we can't have that. Let's figure this out, and we'll give you these concessions so that we can open up trade. But the thing is, Jefferson doesn't grasp, because he's an idealist. It's not because he's not smart enough. Jefferson is an idealist in this. Jefferson is betting that France and Great Britain will realize it's in their interest. He's not thinking that in terms of what he's done, the only group that's going to get hurt here is American shippers and manufacturers. If the United States says, all right, that's it, we're not trading with anybody, the British and the French can go, this doesn't mean anything to us, because either way, the British are going, all this means is that we're not getting trade goods, but neither is France, and that's good for us. And France is looking at this and going, well, with this embargo, we may not get trade goods, but neither is Great Britain, so that's okay with us. So both of them go, fine, don't trade with us, we don't care. Who it hurts, again, is American shippers and manufacturers. Exports in the United States drop, meaning the value of goods that are sent abroad. Exports drop from $108 million to $22 million. That's basically 1/5. We maintain 20% of the marketplace. 30,000 sailors from the commercial sector wind up getting put on the unemployment market. There are manufactured goods just sitting in warehouses, collecting dust. There are tons of crops grown by American farmers that are just sitting in on docks and sitting in cargo bays that are just rotting away. Smuggling winds up increasing during this period, and it's all become just a gigantic headache. Now, in normal times, if the United States saw an increase in smuggling, the Navy could step in and stop all of this stuff. But Jefferson had been, again, an idealist in terms of these ideas of rights and liberty and all of this stuff, so much so that he believed that armies and navies operated to the detriment of liberty. So he had cut the size of the army. The authorized strength was cut from 10,000 men to 2,500, and the Navy was cut down to essentially a coastal defense fleet. So massive warships were decommissioned and then dismantled, and the U.S. had basically a little coastal defense network, and that's it. So smuggling thrived in this period. Now, Jefferson, as all of this is going on, this is happening toward the end of his second term. And in 1808, he makes it clear he is not running for a third term. He's going to follow Washington's precedent and not run for a third term. And his protege, James Madison, actually wins the election of 1808. Now, the plan here, what Jefferson's thinking is this whole thing has really been screwed up, and I'm not gonna be able to fix this, but the least I can do is kind of hand off a clean slate, if you will, to Madison. So what winds up happening is in the last couple of weeks, literally the last couple of weeks of Jefferson's presidency, Congress passes something called the Non-Intercourse Act of 1809. Now, Jefferson is not going to be president He's not running in the election of 1808, but the presidency doesn't change hands until the inauguration the next year. And for the first several elections in American history, the inauguration actually took place in March of the following year, not in January of the following year. So Jefferson is still president until March of 1809. So he hands Madison a clean slate by having Congress pass the Non-Intercourse Act of 1809. Now, what this does, the Non-Intercourse Act specifically repeals the Embargo Act, but it leaves in the provisions that say we are not going to help, or we're not going to trade with Great Britain and France. Now, the way it does this is it says, except with countries that are not protecting our shipping. And for a long time, historians argued that it was, saying that without saying Great Britain. But the actual wording of the Non-Intercourse Act, quite literally in the first two lines, says we're doing this because of Great Britain and France. So it says we're not going to halt trade with everybody, just Great Britain and France. So the United States can go back to trading relationships. Now, why this one is important, why this one worked and the other one didn't, is we're 2 years later at this point. Jefferson, who is very much anti-Napoleon, is out of office once the Non-Intercourse Act takes effect. And Napoleon is 2 years more desperate, 2 years poorer in all of this stuff, and winds up coming to the conclusion, I need American trade. So he bites. He says, I will protect American shipping. Now, it's also equally clear that Napoleon really didn't have a plan to follow through on how he would protect American trade, but it gave the United States the ability to say, all right, Napoleon has promised to protect our shipping. Britain, what do you plan to do? And Great Britain basically told the United States, nothing. We're not doing anything. So the United States ultimately gets into a situation where they are in, again, a sort of quasi-war, except this time it's with Great Britain, and it winds up leading up to a war that many of you have probably heard of, but we're also probably told was relatively unimportant. And that war is the War of 1812. Now, the stated reason for the War of 1812 from the United States' side was that the United States was going to war, quote, to protect its rights on the seas and to defend its national honor. But if we take a deeper look at this, if we look at who voted for and who voted against the war, those who voted against the war were those who were likely to have argued about protecting our rights on the seas. Places like New England tended to vote, the New England states tended to vote against this war because they said this is going to harm commerce. We cannot do this. This is going to stop us from trading. So we cannot do this. Those who lived in the South and who lived in the emerging Western territories, they voted for the war. And the reason is actually pretty simple. The reality of this war was that many of the supporters saw this as an opportunity to destroy British support for Native Americans in the West. And by doing this, this will allow us to conquer all of this territory and control all of this territory in the East. We can get rid of Native Americans, and we can conquer new territory. If we undermine the British position, maybe we can get Canada, which the United States had wanted during the Revolutionary War and couldn't pull off. They also had this idea that we might be able to pull Florida from Spain in the process. So it's about expanding territory and getting rid of people like Native Americans. That's what Southerners are looking at here. And if we look at how this is played out, it plays out very badly. In most history classes, the War of 1812 is a footnote, and I'm sorry to say it's going to be somewhat of a footnote in this class, although we are going to discuss why it's important and who it winds up affecting. But in most classes, if they talk about the military aspects of it, The reason they talk about the military aspects is because the United States is so horribly unprepared for war at this moment. For example, Napoleon Bonaparte, who's still the leader of France throughout all of this stuff, in 1814, he invades uh, Russia with 500,000 soldiers. So he's got these massive armies that he's building to go out and carry out these fights about conquest. Madison looked at Canada, which is this massive expanse of land, and believed that the United States could conquer it with a grand total of 5,000 men. Now, that's trouble. The United States, for one, didn't even have 5,000 men at the start of this war. It had 2,500. And Congress agreed to allow for the enlistment of new volunteers and all of this stuff. But it took a very long time to get those soldiers ready, to get them in fighting shape, to get them equipped, and all of this. So the United States really doesn't win very many battles during this particular fight, during this particular war. Land victories are at a premium. In fact, the most important victory on land that the United States gains, it gains in a battle called the Battle of New Orleans, and that battle happens actually 2 weeks after the war was over. The naval war is not much better. A lot of scholars again talk about the importance of the Navy, and the Navy does win some important battles, but it wins them in a very limited area. The United States started rebuilding its Navy to deal with a potential invasion into Canada, which meant putting ships into the waters of the Great Lakes. So they built ships that were suitable for traveling in the Great Lakes and then traveling upriver. They were not building vessels, the USS Constitution notwithstanding. They're not building a lot of vessels that are going to do well in the open seas. So, does the United States win some naval battles in the Great Lakes? Absolutely, they do. Their number of victories in the open seas, however, were far less. The British still maintained control over the seas. So the War of 1812 is not important from the perspective of our military quote-unquote successes. In fact, the United States capital, Washington, D.C., is actually captured by the British during this period. The first White House is burned to the ground. So this is a disaster on a number of military fronts for the United States. But this war is important from a different perspective. This war is important because of the significance of it's significant because of what happens to the losers, the people who lose out as a consequence of backing the wrong side, if you will, or by simply being the wrong group within this war. For example, when this war is over, the British and the United States agree to something called status quo antebellum. Status quo antebellum means the way things were before the war. It's Latin for the way things were before the war. So the United States and the British sign a treaty that says we're going back to the way things were before. So they're going to pretend nothing happened here. There's not going to be any, quote, territorial aggrandizement. Nobody gets new territories. There are not going to be war reparations. There's not going to be the British saying, okay, we're going to indemnify people for impressment, or we're going to indemnify people for taking their vessels and their cargoes. It's like the war was a big etch-a-sketch, and the United States and the British went and shook it all up and said, we're going back. We're just going to pretend this didn't happen. But that doesn't mean that people don't lose out. Technically, this war was a draw between the United States and the British, but there are significant, important people who lose out during this war. And one group that loses out tremendously is Native Americans. There's one Native American named Tecumseh who had created a confederacy on the basis of Native Americans swearing off any connections to Anglos and trying to learn old ways that they had lost because they were so dependent on white trade. So he creates this loose confederation of Native American groups. It's kind of always on the verge of collapse. They can never really agree that Tecumseh ought to be the leader. They can never really agree on the goals of the group. But during the War of 1812, Tecumseh was smart enough to ally this group, as he saw it, with he was smart enough to do this, to ally it with the British, because the British were telling Native Americans, they were still telling Native Americans, if you side with us, we're going to give you better trade relations, and for all, the more important thing is, we're basically going to leave you alone. You can do whatever you want. We're going to be 5,000 miles away in Great Britain. Yes, we're going to send settlers, but as long as you don't violate British laws, we don't care what you do. And so for a lot of Indians, this was totally different than what they were dealing with American policies. So a lot of Native Americans supported this. But Tecumseh and his followers wound up being defeated at a battle called the Battle of Tippecanoe, which took place in present-day Indiana. And because of that battle, because of the loss, the British largely abandoned the Confederacy. They looked at this Indian Confederation and said, these guys aren't as good as we thought. We can't really depend on them, so we're withdrawing support. Now, Tecumseh, strangely enough, continued fighting along the side of the British during the war with the hope that if he proved himself to be loyal to the British, that they would return their support to the Confederation, and that after the war was over, Tecumseh could rebuild the Confederation and get this idea started again. Those ideas died when Tecumseh himself wound up dying in battle during the War of 1812. At the same time that this is happening, kind of in the northern parts of the war, a fairly unknown general at the time named Andrew Jackson was commanding U.S. forces in the South, and he defeated a group of Indians called the Creek Indians. And the policy that he used against the Creek Indians was that they are enemies of the United States, and therefore we're going to kill every one of them. If we see Creek, we're going to kill them. Jackson was supported in this effort by a number of Indians who were Cherokee Indian and Choctaw Indians, who were kind of the regional enemies of the Creeks. So they participated in this, and it started off a process of Indian removal. Now, these people who are left in the South after the Creek are kind of hunted down and forced to move across the Mississippi River, Indians wind up getting pushed aside. They wind up seeing themselves wounded and defeated with nothing left to fight for. So they wind up abandoning any real hope of opposing westward expansion. Now, the second, quote, loser in this group, and I hate to say it that way because it makes it sound like, as a person, I'm saying these people are a bunch of losers. But when I say losers in this context, it's about losing position in the world and in the geopolitical world. Spain loses out, and they're not even really in the war with the United States and Great Britain. But what Spain is involved in that broader war that's going on in Europe during this period. This is the War of 1812 is connected to that war in that the British are kind of looking at this going, we've got this war that we're fighting here in Europe. Oh, we've got this little annoying thing that's going on in North America with the United States. So Britain is fighting Spain at the same time, but they're fighting them in Europe, not here in North America. Now, the United States obviously fails at conquering Canada, and they failed at conquering Florida as well. But, and when I say they failed, it's largely a failure because they didn't send any forces into Florida and even try anything. However, there was a message that Spain took from all of this stuff. Spain, watching from afar, saw the United States, this little kind of a podunk power, that's who the United States is at this moment. This little power that was ill-prepared from a military standpoint, from a naval standpoint, and they had somehow just fought this great superpower, England, to a draw. Spain takes a very important message away from that. After this war is over, the United States is going to almost immediately turn their attention and turn their focus toward Florida. And ultimately, they're going to tell Spain, you need to give us Florida, quote, or else. And Spain kind of weighs the or else and says, we'll take the give it. We'll take the give it to you. We'll come back to that. We'll circle back to that in a few minutes. So Spain loses position geopolitically as a consequence of this war. Also, American trade had actually been destroyed as a consequence of the war. I don't think that should shock you given what I talked about with the Embargo Act and the Non Intercourse Act. Planters in the South and merchants in the North were trying to find ways to make money because they couldn't ship goods overseas. Planters from the South couldn't take all of this cotton they're growing and send it to, say, England because we're at war with England. So they couldn't send it to English textile mills and have it turned into something. So the change that these people make, those northern manufacturers and bankers and financiers get together with these southern cotton growing planters and they create a solution, the textile mills. They create an internal marketplace in the United States by building textile mills across what's called the Middle Atlantic region. The Middle Atlantic region is very simple. It's basically the American coastline from Virginia up to about New York State. So this whole region, the United States is going to get together, and all of these manufacturers, financiers, and cotton planters are going to get together, and they're just going to put textile mills all across this area. So now there's an outlet for all of the cotton that these guys are growing in the South. But these investors also wound up doing something that changed the role of slaves in the United States economy and changed the role of free labor in the United States economy. The textile mills unquestionably rejuvenate slavery or they unquestionably rejuvenate the economy by creating a need for the cotton. But they also rejuvenate slavery in this way. Up until the 1790s, most people thought slavery was going to die out of inertia, and especially cotton growers thought that, we're growing cotton and it's profitable enough, but it's not super profitable. So maybe we're in the wrong business. Maybe we could do something that'll get us more profit for what we're doing. But in 1792, a guy named Eli Whitney created something called the cotton gin. Gin being short for engine. It's pictured here on the slide. And this cotton gin made it really easy and cheap to, quote, clean cotton. Cotton comes in this fiber that grows on a thicket. Okay, all you got to do is just go and Google some pictures of cotton being grown to see what I'm talking about. It grows on this thicket. The person who picks the cotton reaches in, pulls it off of that thicket or bramble, and then puts it in a bag. That's how the process, quote, starts. Now, as the people who are picking that cotton, what they do is they go through a cotton field and they're kind of bent over, hunched over, with a bag on their back so that they can just pick cotton and throw it in the bag. Pick, throw in the bag. Pick, throw in the bag. And then the next step is before the cotton gin. The next step was to take all of the cotton in the bag, dump it on a table where people would, by hand, go through that cotton fiber, that little white piece that looks like a cotton ball, and they'd separate the seeds out of the fiber. Well, why the cotton gin is so important is a slaveholder up to this point had to dedicate half of his slave workforce to picking cotton, the other half to, quote, cleaning the cotton. With the cotton gin, you needed 2 enslaved people to, quote, clean the cotton. One person to dump cotton into the top part, which was essentially a feeder, where the cotton would drop down, and then you got another person who's turning the crank. Now that crank, when it gets turned, you can see on the picture here, it's got all of these things that look like dots on the wheel. Those are kind of combs, and what happens is those things, when that wheel gets turned, those combs go through the cotton and separate the seeds out of the cotton fiber. The cotton fiber drops to one side, the seeds fall to the other side. So it's now all of a sudden much more efficient to, quote, clean cotton. So all of a sudden, because it's efficient and it creates profits, And there's a market for it now with the War of 1812 in the textile industry. People across the South are going, well, I got to get in to the cotton business. So it means people buying up lots of land for the purpose of putting that land into cultivation. But then these cotton growers also rationalize that there's two other things that they need. They need a cotton gin and they need a number of slaves, because they look at it and say, just like those gentlemen back in the 1600s we talked about, these hands don't go out and pick cotton, but enslaved people's hands do go out and pick cotton. So that's one group that loses out. But free labor also loses out, because when these mills started popping up across the middle Atlantic region, they created a ton of jobs in the United States. But the jobs, the people that these textile mills employed, were what came to be known as mill girls. The owners of these things looked at it and said, we've got a labor cost that we need to build into our model, and we can either pay quote unquote free laborers, which were traditionally considered to be adult male workers who need to have a living wage, they need to make enough money to support their families, or they said, we can pay less wages by employing girls. And when I say girls, I do mean girls. We're talking about children as young as 8 are working in these textile mills. And the reason for this is actually very simple. They could cut their costs in terms of their labor by 2/3, because they only paid these little girls about a third of what they paid adult male workers. Plus, they were a temporary workforce. These young girls were expected, once they started getting older, once they started growing up, they were expected to leave the workforce and go home and be wives and mothers. So, since they're a temporary workforce by nature, they're not going to organize, they're not going to create labor unions and the like. So, this has the effect of hurting free labor, because it hurts the development of unions. Plus, it depresses wages. Wages work in such a way that when everybody starts making money, wages across the board go up. But if one industry can find a way to put a stop to wage growth, if they can tamp down on wages, it has a broader effect throughout the rest of the economy. It hurts wage earning. So the textile mills operated in this way. Now, the fourth group that's going to lose out, again, they lose out from a political standpoint, is the Federalist Party. The War of 1812 destroys the first two-party system. Now, the Federalists were almost destroyed by the Northern Confederacy, but they had actually grown stronger after the embargo of 1807. When the War of 1812 rolled around, they refused to support the war. They wouldn't vote for it. They refused to support troop increases. They refused to support loans that would have paid for the war. And all of this sort of stuff. They just simply said, we're not helping support this war. So they started getting a lot more people flocking to their ideas. Not ideas about the economy, but ideas about being against this particular war. So, using this newfound political strength, they call a meeting in Hartford, Connecticut, that they call the Hartford Convention. It starts meeting in December of 1813. And at this Hartford Convention, they agree that the Constitution must be amended. Now, as they understood, these people understood the process very well. The Constitution can be amended in two ways. There are processes for creating amendments that can originate at the state level, at the federal government level, or there can be a call for a new constitutional convention. So at the Hartford Convention, the Federalists say, we are calling for a new constitutional convention for the purpose of amending the United States Constitution. And what they want changed, they've got a very clear list of things they want changed. Now, these, again, are the things that you see on the screen. They are proposals by the Federalists at the Hartford Convention. What they want the Three-Fifths Compromise eliminated. They want a one-term limit to be put on the presidency. They looked at this and said, the problems that we're in right now are the problems that have been created because Jefferson was able to have 2 terms and engage in long-range planning. Madison looks like he's going to serve 2 terms and have this long-range planning. Maybe the best idea is a 1-term limit for the presidency. They also wanted a limit or a rule that said that the president can't come from the same state in back-to-back elections. And this is clearly aimed at Madison and Jefferson and what was being referred to as the Virginia dynasty at this point. And think about why they're calling it a Virginia dynasty. George Washington is from Virginia. John Adams is the exceptional. He's from Massachusetts. Thomas Jefferson is from Virginia. James Madison is from Virginia. And then after James Madison, we're going to have a guy named James Monroe who will also be from Virginia. So that's 4 out of 5 presidents coming from Virginia. So these people are looking at this and saying Virginians control the national government. This got to stop. So that's why they want this rule. And then they also say that there's this issue of war is too important to leave to a simple majority. Now remember, a simple majority is 50% plus 1. It only takes a simple majority for Congress to declare war. They said it's too important an issue, so we want an amendment that says it requires a 2/3 majority for Congress to declare war. And then they say flat out, if we don't get what we want, we're going to secede. Now, who was going to secede? Who knows? Because this is a plot. This is a group that is on some level a national group. So the idea that the Federalists could secede is kind of strange. But it's clear that New Englanders are at the forefront of this. So they're talking secession again by January of 1814. But their support and this newfound power comes to a crashing halt for them. And especially with this talk of secession, it comes to a crashing halt. At the same time that they're meeting, Andrew Jackson is fighting the British in New Orleans. Now, Jackson had a force of about 10,000 men, but it was a force that was comprised primarily of militia, a number of free blacks who had either emancipated themselves by running away from slavery or who had been freed by their slave owners in one form or another, a number of white quote-unquote pirates, a number of Indians. So this 10,000 man army that he's got is not exactly the vision of an army, as you see here on the in the upper right-hand side of this picture. Now, the British, by contrast, have a 2-to-1 numerical advantage. They're very well trained. They are a quote-unquote professional force as opposed to this militia. And it looks like Jackson is going to get his butt kicked at New Orleans. However, Jackson does something truly smart. He sets up on the western banks of the Mississippi River. This is where he sets up his defensive positions and forces the British to march through mud to get at him. Now, I don't know where you all have lived before, but one truism about the Mississippi River is in the early parts of the year, it's going to flood, and all that stuff is going to wash up on the western banks of the river, and it's going to be muddy and mucky and gross, and just it's going to be like a swamp in that area. So the British are marching through this, and they're stuck. And Jackson tells his men not to fire until these British are stuck in these areas, and they start to fire on the British. They wind up inflicting more than 2,000 casualties on the British forces, and Jackson himself only suffers a grand total of 23 casualties, 15 wounded and 8 dead. So it is, from a tactical standpoint, whatever bad I'm going to say about Jackson, and that's a hint, I'm going to say a lot bad about Andrew Jackson. Whatever bad I'm going to say about Andrew Jackson, from a tactical standpoint, the guy was a genius. Now, because of the coincidence of these two things, the Battle of New Orleans and the Federalists coming out and having this argument about seceding, all of a sudden, Americans hear this stuff about the Battle of New Orleans and go, well, it's the Federalists who have been the problem all along. Jackson defeats the British and defeats them easily. So people are going, well, maybe if the Federalists hadn't held up loans, maybe if the Federalists had been a little bit more pro military, maybe if this, maybe if that, we would have won this war and it wouldn't have been a stalemate. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the Battle of New Orleans takes place 2 weeks after the treaty has actually been signed. But you have to understand, in a time like this, during this period, there are no text alerts, there's no 24-hour news service or anything like that. So there's nothing to provide these people who are out there fighting. They can't go, oh, what? The fighting stopped, the war's over. All right, everybody stop what you're doing. That can't happen. So the treaty contained a provision that said military acts that happen between this day and this day are not going to be considered a reason to restart the war. And the Battle of New Orleans happened in the middle of that period. So the Battle of New Orleans really destroys the Federalist Party. But the Battle of New Orleans is important for another reason here. The Battle of New Orleans also marked a turning point in American history. Now, a lot of times historians talk about turning points, and they're not that easy to see. You have to spend a lot of time looking for things to say, there it is. There's the moment where it all changed. The Battle of New Orleans is no different, but I think that the Battle of New Orleans is a little bit more clear as a turning point. It spurred a whole new outlook in the United States, a whole new way of thinking about our nation, because all of these people are coming out of the Battle of New Orleans and saying, if only this, we could have done this. Because of this, it spurs a whole new way of looking at the United States' experience. And it's going to be reflected in 4 distinct incidents. The creation of the Monroe Doctrine. It's going to be reflected in our first expansion crisis, the Missouri Compromise, the Missouri Crisis. It's going to be seen in one of the earliest slave rebellions to affect the, quote, United States. This would be the Denmark-Vesey Conspiracy. And then we're going to see it in 3 Supreme Court cases. We're going to see a whole new idea about the United States. Now, what all of these things have in common, all 4 of them on the board, is that the roots for all of these are happening in 1819. 1819 is one of those crucial years in American history. We think of important years as being, just these sort of, there's a hallmark moment. Like 1941 is when Japan attacks Pearl Harbor, or 1492 is when Christopher Columbus, quote, discovers America. Those are hallmark moments. But 1890 has a number of these sorts of moments. 1819, for example, is going to mark the United States' first experience with an economic depression called the Panic of 1819. It's the first time that the United States is going to have bread lines and soup kitchens and high unemployment rates. 20% unemployment was the norm during the Panic of 1819. It was a challenge for the way Americans thought about themselves, because they could no longer attack Europeans as having this permanent class of poor people and say, but we don't have that problem. That permanent underclass develops here in the United States as well. 1819 is going to see the establishment, and these are things that we're going to deal with in future classes. I'm just kind of laying out some groundwork for you here. 1819 is going to see the establishment of the first asylum in the United States in Hartford, Connecticut, aimed, as it said in its initial documents, quote, aimed at those among us who are deaf, dumb, and blind. Why this asylum is so important? For the first time in our history, the United States is trying to deal with a social problem by creating an institution to solve it. And this institutionalization in the United States is going to lead to the creation of not just asylums like these for the deaf, blind, and mute, but also for the mentally disabled. It's going to create orphanages. It's going to lead to an increase in what are called penitentiaries. even the development of public schools. These are all going to be part of this push toward institutionalization in the United States. 1819 sees the establishment of the first quote-unquote liberal, small l, liberal religion. The religion's name is Unitarianism. What made Unitarianism distinct is that they, in part, they're distinct because they viewed the Bible as mostly metaphor. They thought that the Bible is critically important. They weren't saying throw out the Bible, but they were saying for the most part it's metaphor. It's critical to helping people understand what's good and bad, what's moral and what's not moral. But we don't read the Bible and say every word of this is true. Is word for word accurate. It's all truth. It's no embellishment. Therefore, we have to obey everything. They preferred thought. They preferred intuition and logic over the idea of dogma. But another thing that's important is that the Unitarians believed that people were basically good, not that people are basically evil. And because people are basically good, that anybody could go to heaven. It's not just a thing, a place that's limited to those who God has, quote, chosen to go to heaven. So we're going to see, when we talk about the Second Great Awakening, an evolution in terms of religious thought, again, just like we did with the First Great Awakening. Now, we also see the conquest of Florida in 1819, and what this is going to do is it's going to set a tone for a new type of foreign policy, an aggressive and expansionist foreign policy, one that's unapologetically expansionist and imperialistic, but it's something that we had not seen up to this point. We're going to see the issue of slavery appearing in Congress. It's going to be debated. There's no hiding from the issue of slavery. And we're also going to see the South threatening to secede as a result of this. We're going to see the North backing down in an effort to keep the South in to the United States. And then we're going to see 3 new Supreme Court cases that establish once and for all that this country is a capitalist nation, and we're going to, through our legal structure, support and reinforce capitalism. Now, another reason why 1819 is so important is that it seems to also mark the beginning of a whole new generation of Americans. If we look at the 1820 census, for example, 10% of the American populace, actually less than 10%, could actually personally remember the American Revolution. Now, remember, the American Revolution is basically 1775 to 1783. So it's not that long in a period of time. But, and the country is not even 50 years old yet. But there are very few people who can actually remember it. The average age in the United States hovered at around 15 years. So this is a very young country. So it should not surprise you to find that that old leadership and the old ways of doing things, what people said, this is what America is, that old way was going by the wayside. And new leaders are coming in with newer ideas. That founding generation, the generation of George Washington and Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, it's gone. 2 of these guys are dead, and 2 of them have long retired from public life. But now we've got new leadership in 1819. We've got new leadership coming not only from a new generation, but from different places than the old order. The old order, the Revolutionary Order, was pretty much the leaders of Massachusetts and the leaders of Virginia. Remember that whole art problem about the Virginia dynasty here. Well, now we've got leaders like John C. Calhoun, who has by this time served as Secretary of War and a U.S. Congressman. He's from South Carolina. He's young. He's got ideas about national expansion. He's got ideas about using internal improvements, but he hates the ideas of Alexander Hamilton. So crazy on some level. Meaning politically, in political speak, it's kind of crazy. But it's new. It's something that Americans could not have foreseen. Guys like Henry Clay, the guy pictured on the top right of the board or of the screen, he's at the moment the Speaker of the House of Representatives from Kentucky. So he's from the West. He's from one of the first states to come in from the Western territories. Just below Clay is Andrew Jackson, who is unknown from a political standpoint, but he's a general and he's very popular. And he's from Tennessee, again, a Western state. The only real holdover from the original generation, from the founding generation, and I guess sort of the bridge between the two generations, is the guy pictured on the bottom left of this second group of leaders. That's John Quincy Adams, who is the son of John Adams. But even he has a totally different take on what the United States is and what it ought to be. He is going to say things like the United States goes abroad not in search of monsters to destroy, but in fact, he's going to push for the greatest amount of expansionism in American history. So he's clearly okay with this sort of stuff. So, with these new ideas, with these new leaders coming from new places, a lot of people worried about what's going to happen, what is going to become of the nation. Are the quote unquote Republican ideals, are they gone? Is it going to be a whole different country? Well, the question is going to turn on what do we do about slavery? How do we do expansion? What do all of the things that we're going to be doing, what do they mean for the power of the national government? So, we're going to start with the so-called Missouri Crisis of 1819. Now, Missouri is going to apply for admission as a slave state. It's going to be the first territory to come out of the Louisiana Purchase territory. But many lawmakers saw this as a problem because the United States had a law in place called the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. Now, to be clear about this, the Northwest Ordinance specifically covered the Northwest Territory, places like Michigan, Wisconsin, parts of present-day Minnesota, Indiana, Illinois, Ohio. Those were all parts of the old, quote, Northwest Territory. But what the Northwest Ordinance said was that slave states could not be admitted out of that Northwest Territory, that neither slavery in the territory nor in the states that come out of that territory would be legal. So, it's creating a precedent. A lot of people said it's only about the Northwest Territory, but many more said, yeah, it does only say Northwest Territory, but it's what we call a precedent. We couldn't have accounted for owning Louisiana. We can't account for maybe someday owning California. All we can do is say that we've established a procedure where slavery does not accompany expansion. Now, people in Missouri were furious about this. People in Missouri were saying, we brought our slaves with us, their property, this is not legal, this cannot happen. We want to be a slave state. So, James Talmadge of New York offered what he believed was a compromise position to their amendment for statehood. He said, right up until statehood, people in Missouri can bring in all the slaves they want. But the day Missouri becomes a state, it will be illegal to transport slaves to Missouri. And all slaves in Missouri are to be freed at the age of 25. Now, he had support for this in the House of Representatives. The House supported it overwhelmingly, but the Senate overwhelmingly rejected this position. We'll see why in a couple of lectures. But the House approves it, the Senate overwhelmingly rejected it. So Talmadge's amendment, out. And we're still left with this question. Will Missouri come in as a free state or as a slave state? And for some, the answer is obvious. Thomas Jefferson, who's been retired for years now, decides, I'm going to jump into the fray on this one. And he says the issue about slavery can no longer be laid to rest, meaning we can't just not debate it anymore. He says we can no longer lay this to rest. Northerners are, quote, Federalists who have betrayed the legacy of 1776. Now, that may not sound insulting to you on the surface, but Jefferson is saying that these Northerners are people who are betraying the legacy of the Revolution. They're betraying the legacy that says all men are endowed by their Creator with the following rights: the right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. He's saying they are betraying that. And worse, they're Federalists. And remember, Federalist is a dirty word around these parts now because of the Hartford Convention. Jefferson takes the next logical step with it. He says, if Missourians are not allowed to bring slavery, they're not allowed to have slavery when Missouri comes in, then Southern states ought to secede. This is how we'll handle it this time. If you've read the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, you know already that Jefferson flat out said, we're not writing these documents to promote secession. But now he's saying we will use the doctrine of states' rights to secede because we're allowed to. Now, the Northern position and the Southern position could not have been more different. Okay, Jefferson is saber rattling here, but you've got two clearly different sides. This North's position is starting to develop that slavery is contrary to the laws of God. That means Northerners, more often than not, are starting to say slavery is a sin. And they also are pointing again to this idea that the Northwest Ordinance established an anti-slavery precedent. So in every way, what we've already offered you is more than you deserve. The compromise we offered with the Talmadge Amendment was a compromise you do not deserve. The Southern position was very simple, embodied in what Jefferson was talking about. The United States is a union of equals. That's what compact theory essentially holds, that there are equal component states. They are all entitled to the same rights. The people who live in those states have the same right to property as anybody else, and they should not be told that they cannot move that property. And think about it in these terms. If you want to think about it in terms of a mug is property, a cell phone is property, a pen is property, these people are saying, you guys don't like to hear it, but so are slaves. So if you could move a pen or a phone or a mug, you're allowed to move slaves without being told you can't do it. On top of all of this, there's something else that's at stake here. There were 22 states in the Union at this moment, 11 free and 11 states. That meant that they were completely in balance in the Congress. The House of Representatives, Northern population is starting to exceed Southern population. So in the House, theoretically, anti-slavery people hold a majority. The South needs congressional balance to remain if they are to forestall any chance or forestall any problems with the issue of slavery. So they're saying if we bring Missouri in as a free state, it means 12 free states, 11 slave states, we're done. We're done for. So what winds up happening as these people are fighting over this stuff, the Speaker of the House, Henry Clay, comes up with a compromise. The compromise is going to be this. Missouri will be admitted as a slave state. But so that we don't upset the balance, the same balance that the South was talking about, Massachusetts is going to be split into two states. The northernmost part will be admitted as the state of Maine in 1820 to offset the state of Missouri. So there will be two states brought in, not one. Missouri will be brought in as a slave state. Maine will be brought in as a free state. Thus, we've got 12 to 12. Congressional balance is preserved. So that's part one. Part two is a line will be drawn across the rest of the Louisiana Purchase at 36 degrees 30 minutes north latitude. What the 3630 line is going to hold, what the reason for this is that any territory above the 3630 line in the Louisiana Purchase territory, any territory above that 3630 line will be admitted as free states. Anything below it as slave territory. Now, if you look at the map that's on the board, it obviously doesn't really support the South. The South loses a lot. They've got Missouri, which is already in, and below the 3630 line is really just the Arkansas territory. Everything else in that V-shaped territory is in the north. So there's a lot more potential for northern states than there are southern states. But what Southerners are going to do, they're going to look at this as a victory anyway. Because what they're going to say is that first thing is that they've proved that there are no precedents when it comes to slavery and expansion. If the United States, for example, if you look at this map, if the United States were to expand into, quote, New Spain, as it was then known, if the United States were to expand into New Spain, then the whole discussion of free versus slave starts over again. And if worst comes to worst, we can argue, they say, for the expansion of the 3630 line across New Spain territory. And what you don't see on this map is all of present-day Mexico, which is below that 3630 line. So there's a ton of territory for new states. So what this does is this makes Southerners much more committed to national expansion than anything else ever could have made them. So the Missouri Compromise is really, really important. Now, the other thing that happens as a consequence of these Missouri Compromise debates is related to the issue of slavery. The debates in all of this stuff, in all of this crisis, these debates are, the rhetoric is heated. Senator Freeman Walker, for example, said, quote, of Georgia, says, quote, a civil war, a brother's sword crimsoned with a brother's blood, would be the only thing that could come of not allowing the South to admit, quote, slave states. James Talmadge, who had proposed the Talmadge Amendment to Missouri's statehood application, said, quote, if blood is necessary to extinguish any fire, which I have assisted to kindle, I can assure you, gentlemen, while I regret the necessity, I shall not forbear to contribute my might. So they're talking. We're going to fight. We will fight over the issue of slavery if we have to. And then to throw even more rhetoric into this, the New York Advertiser, a prominent newspaper of the time, playing to public opinion, said the following, quote, this question, meaning the question of whether we admit free states or slave states, this question involves not only the future character of our nation, but the future weight and influence of free states. If now lost, meaning the influence of free states, if now lost, it is lost forever. So these people are already in 1820 worrying about what happens if there's more free states than slave states, or from the Southern perspective, what happens if there's more free states than slave states. Everybody is worried about how this is going to play out. Now, in the midst of all of this, almost immediately after this, we see a slave rebellion in the South, led by a former slave named at the moment. He's named Denmark Vesey. Now, I'm going to call this an alleged slave rebellion, and it was supposedly masterminded by Denmark Vesey, who had been born into slavery in the 1760s and had been named, quote, Telemaque at his birth. But in 1799, he had entered a lottery, and he'd earned some money by selling goods at marketplace. He had entered a lottery wound up winning, I think it was $1,200 in this lottery, and then purchased his freedom. So he owned himself now. Now, this happens in Charleston, South Carolina, and Vasey was a very well-known carpenter and craftsman. There was a big market for his services. Plus, he had a lot of friends in the community, and he helped establish the first African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina. So he's a critically important figure within the slave community. So he decided, I'm not leaving. I'm not going to leave Charleston, South Carolina. And in addition to his work as a carpenter, he also became an itinerant preacher during this period. Now, according to what the state of South Carolina argued, the plot was a very simple plot. Vasey would organize slaves to rebel on the second Sunday of July in 1822. Excuse me. Now, why that is important? Both of these were important as the state of South Carolina saw it. Slaves were allowed to go to marketplace on Sunday in Charleston. The reason was slave owners went to church on Sunday, and while they talked about the souls of their enslaved, they did not want their slaves in church with them on Sunday. So they simply said, well, we'll give them Sundays off. So enslaved people were allowed to go to marketplace on Sundays. They were allowed to take pottery that they'd made, or take vegetables that they'd grown in a garden, or fish or animals that they'd caught or trapped. This is likely how Vasey himself actually entered this lottery, by selling wares like that at marketplace. So they're allowed to go to marketplace on Sunday. It's not going to arouse suspicion if a large number of slaves are congregated into marketplace on Sunday. The second Sunday in July is also important, because in July, it's right in the middle of yellow fever and malaria season. South Carolinians literally called this period, this part of the summer, quote, the sick season. So a number of white South Carolinians left the state, and this meant that South Carolina had a majority enslaved population, in some cases as high as 9-1. So, according to the state when they make their case, Vasey's put together this rebellion on the second Sunday in July to bring the slaves out. Their plan is to go out and they're going to fight against slaveholders. They're going to build this massive army of former slaves who are going to self-emancipate themselves. They're going to head down to the harbor in Charleston, commandeer a ship, and go to the independent Republic of Haiti. Now, that's the state's story. Vasey, if he actually individually supported this, and if he supported the date, it was likely because of its coincidence with the anniversary of the French Revolution. It quite literally, the second Sunday in July would have coincided with Bastille Day. So if Vasey were actually part of this, then that was a more likely answer, because while Vasey was emancipated himself in South Carolina, he was actually born in the Virgin Islands and was very well aware of what had happened in Haiti. Now, why I say if Vasey was involved in all of this stuff. The rebellion, such as it was, fell apart before it actually happened. At least two of the people who were involved in the plot told their owners about what happened. The state of South Carolina very quickly organized a militia and put down the Vasey Rebellion, as it was called. Ultimately, they arrested 137 people and hanged 40 of them, including Vasey himself. Now, this stuff that I've been telling you about here, this was all pretty much how South Carolina's officials saw it. Now, their version of this notwithstanding, most modern scholars actually believe that the fear around the Vasey Rebellion is either manufactured, that Vasey himself was, he was a victim of this. He was, people put this on him, and he wasn't really the ringleader of it, or that the fear of the rebellion was exaggerated because it really never got that close to fruition. But what's undoubtable, what's undebatable, regardless of whether the Vasey Rebellion is a result of fear run amok or whether it was we caught it just in time, what's clear is that Southerners are terrified because enslaved people and former slaves like Vasey are hearing about all of this stuff and planning to take action about it. Now, another person who clearly had a stake in all of this and heard some of the same things that Vasey was hearing out of these hearings out of the Missouri crisis, and overtly said flat out, "It's me. I did it. I heard all of this stuff." So there was no questioning whether he did or didn't. This was a free black launderer named David Walker. Walker got copies of all of these speeches that were being made in the House and in the Senate about the Missouri crisis, and he put them together in this pamphlet that wound up being called Walker's Appeal. Now, Walker lived in Boston, Massachusetts. He was a free black person. He served primarily a black clientele. These were merchant sailors, obviously not U.S. Navy sailors, because the United States does not allow black sailors in this particular era. They're primarily merchant sailors. So black sailors who come into port in places like Boston, they're going to get their laundry done by David Walker, and then they're going to get back on their ships and go to the next port. So what Walker's plan is, he's going to write this pamphlet, stuff it in the laundry of these sailors, and then they'll go to places like Baltimore, Charleston, Norfolk, Virginia, and then they'll distribute these pamphlets across the entire South. Now, what Walker's Appeal, it's literally titled Walker's Appeal. That's our shorthand, but listen to the full title of it. Walker's Appeal in 4 articles together with a preamble to the colored citizens of the world, but in particularly and very expressly to those of the United States of America. What Walker is appealing for here is very simple. He's calling on enslaved people to overthrow the rule of slave owners. Simple. Now, it should not surprise you to find out that Walker, shortly after the publication of this in 1829, Walker was found dead of mysterious causes in the doorway of his laundry shop. But Walker was a well-known abolitionist. It's not surprising that he was found dead, and it's equally unsurprising that nobody was ever charged with in connection with his death. But Southerners took something away from Vasey's Rebellion and from Walker's Appeal. They took a lesson away in all of this stuff. They had to change. The South needed to change. And before any of you are going, "Oh, thank God they concluded they've got to end slavery," no. They conclude we've got to tighten our grip on the issue of slavery. Southerners, for example, implemented in Congress something informally called the gag rule. And why I say informally, it's never actually a procedural rule. It's something that gets done on a case-by-case basis when things come in that are about debating the issue of slavery, or when legislation is proposed about slavery, or things like that. When they come in, Southerners band together to kill debate, saying, "We're not going to debate the issue of slavery," and their rationale is very simple. Slavery is a local issue. It is not a national issue. Slavery is what we do in, say, Charleston, South Carolina, or Northampton, Virginia, or Jamestown, Virginia, or wherever, Atlanta, Georgia. This is what we do. It's got nothing to do with you guys. You guys ended slavery, so stay out of our business. So that's one thing, implementation of the gag rule. Secondly, Southern states began the suppression of anti-slavery societies. They said anti-slavery societies are not welcome here. We don't care about freedom of speech. We don't care if you're allowed to do it. We aren't the government, so we're not going to allow you to do this. And they quite literally, in some cities and towns across the South, give people 24 hours to get out of Dodge or, quote, else. Every Southern state passes a law that makes it illegal to teach slaves to read. When they find out that enslaved people are reading Walker's Appeal and things like that, they come to the conclusion reading can only do something bad for the enslaved. They'll learn, they'll read, they'll start learning about other things. They'll learn about the plight of enslaved people worldwide. They'll come to the conclusion that slavery is bad, surprise, and then they'll be useless as slaves. So we've got to stop this. We've got to stop this ability of these people to put these bad ideas into the heads of enslaved people. So every single state in the South bans teaching enslaved people how to read. But I think the most important thing that happens is how the South actually characterizes the institution of slavery. The South begins characterizing the institution of slavery as a benefit. Now, up to this point, virtually everybody had talked about it in the same way that Thomas Jefferson had. Thomas Jefferson said that slavery was like holding a wolf by the ear. You dare not hold on for very long, but you dare not let go either. So what he was saying is Southerners need slavery because they don't have another labor force. So, quote, we need it, so we've got to hold on to it. But if we hold on to it for too long, it's going to be a problem for us. It's going to turn around and cause more problems for us. So that's the way most Southerners looked at slavery. However, after Vesey's Rebellion, after the publication of Walker's Appeal, Southern people start arguing, no, slavery is a benefit. Jefferson's wrong. It's not this sort of, quote, necessary evil, to use Tom Cotton's words. It is a benefit. It benefits us, obviously, they say. Benefits us, the slaveholders, they say. It benefits the entire national economy because all of those shippers and merchants and manufacturers up north who are so anti-slavery, they don't have products to make or ships that can be filled without what we grow here in the South. So we are the thing that links the economy. And then they also say slavery benefits, this is hard to believe, they argue slavery even benefits the enslaved. Now, it's not hard to figure out why they're coming to these conclusions. They are convinced they're under attack. They are under siege from all of these outside pressures, so they've got to gather around the institution of slavery. Now, the next area where we see change across American society is in the area of expansion. Now, I mentioned that one of the, quote, losers of the War of 1812 was the Spanish government. Because of how Americans look at Florida. Now, up to this point, most Americans did not perceive themselves as being expansionist or the country as a whole as being a, quote, expansionist nation. They said, no, we're concerned about internal security. We're not worried about going abroad and conquering areas, but Florida provides a challenge to all of this. Florida at this point was controlled in name only by the Spanish government. In reality, it was controlled by one of those maroon communities of Indians, runaway slaves, and outlaw pirates and the like. This group in Florida was the Seminole group, and they raided into Georgia almost constantly because they knew that Florida and Georgia represented an international boundary. So as long as they were able to get back into Florida, they were okay. Now, Georgians, on the other hand, were demanding that something be done to stop the Seminole. And finally, the United States government listened to the Georgian state government and sent Andrew Jackson with a contingent of soldiers to deal with the Seminole. Now, Jackson was given an order that, despite what it sounds like, was not exactly clear. Jackson was told he was free to use, quote, all means at your disposal. Now, using all means at your disposal typically is interpreted as using all legal means to your disposal. But Jackson read all means at your disposal and said, I can basically do what I want. So Jackson goes out against the Seminole when they start raiding. He chases them. They make it to Florida. Their thought is, we have made it beyond the international boundary. And then they are stunned to find that Andrew Jackson has pursued them into Florida. Now, as Jackson is in pursuit of them, Jackson winds up getting distracted because in Florida, again controlled by Spain, there is a British trading post in Florida. And Jackson, when he gets there and sees this British trading post, he just loses it. And he demands to know who's in charge. Two British settlers come up and say, "We're the ones." And Jackson orders these two British settlers to be hanged. And then he orders that the British flag be taken down and the American flag raised up over this trading post. Now, both Great Britain and Spain immediately flip out and want to know, what are you, President James Monroe, going to do about Andrew Jackson, who has killed two British civilians and invaded Florida, and by virtue of putting that flag up, claimed that it now belongs to the United States? Now, as far as the British, they make no bones about it. They say, we want him extradited to Great Britain. We're going to put him on trial for murder, and we're going to hang him, period. The Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, is going to be in charge of the response. And he tells the British, look, we're sorry this happened. It's our bad. We feel bad. Jackson feels bad. But this happened in the course of a military engagement. And as much as you want it to happen, we're not turning over one of our officers to you, and we're not going to let you hang him. So he says, you're going to have to settle. And he doesn't literally say it this way, but he says, you're going to have to settle for an apology from the United States government, and you're going to have to come up with a number so that we can indemnify the families of these two guys. But beyond that, we're not doing this. We're not helping you. With the Spanish, it's a little bit different. When the Spanish are saying, what the hell's going on here, John Quincy Adams tells them, hey, this problem is entirely of your making. And Spain, you can probably figure out, how's it our making? Adams tells them, if you guys had exerted any control whatsoever over the Seminole, we wouldn't have had to do this. Jackson wouldn't have even been sent down there. Now, to make it clear here, John Quincy Adams does not like Andrew Jackson at all. But he also knows that there are broader ramifications if he caves in. There's broader ramifications if he just turns over Andrew Jackson. So even though he hates the guy, he's not going to do any of this stuff. So he tells Spain, I say he gives Spain an ultimatum. And the ultimatum is this: either exert control over Florida or give it to somebody who can. And he's got somebody in mind. It's us. It's the United States. And ultimately, the United States and Spain conclude a treaty. I'm not going to make you remember it. It's called, for trivia's sake, it's called the Adams-Onis Treaty, which gives the United States Florida in return for an indemnity to the nation of Spain. Now, when John Quincy Adams starts thinking about this, he starts thinking, that actually went a little easier than I thought. I didn't really think they'd go for it. I thought I'd have to fight him on it. So I think something else is going on here. And it turns out that what really was going on was Spain was on the verge of collapse. The Spanish government did this because they knew they could not fight a war against the United States. So they tried to play it off politically. But after all of this happens with the purchase of Spanish Florida, all of a sudden, the Spanish government collapses. And now what John Quincy Adams fears is that since the government in Spain has collapsed, there's going to be a rush of European powers into the Western Hemisphere, into the continents of North and South America, to try to pick up the pieces of the Spanish Empire. He believes, convinced the French will come into present-day Mexico. The British will be all over South America. He's terrified that the Russian government, which has not engaged in much colonialism at this point, they'll come through and start going into these areas. So we got to find a way to stop all of this. So what Adams does is he convinces James Monroe, the President of the United States, to unilaterally issue what came to be known as the Monroe Doctrine. And the Monroe Doctrine is very simple. First thing it states is that the United States will not allow any European nations to colonize in the Western Hemisphere. No new colonies. If a country like Great Britain, for example, already has a colony in, say, the Falkland Islands, just off the coast of Argentina, that's one thing. But they can't come in and say, Spain got out of here, so we now control Argentina. They can't do that. So no new colonization in the Americas, period. Secondly, it affirms that the United States will consider any act of colonization by a European power to be an act of war. So we're going to war over this. If you don't believe us, try us, we'll go to war. And then third, because Adams knows that the European powers are not just going to go, "Oh, well the Americans have said this, so well, we have to do it." Got to give them some sort of an inducement. So Adams tells them that in this third point, the United States will no longer support revolutionary movements in Europe. So, you guys who are worried about the United States coming in and supporting revolutionaries in France or Spain or German principalities, don't worry about it. We're not going to do it. So, this is an aggressive foreign policy, and it's a new type of foreign policy, whether you realize it or not. The United States was now saying, instead of what the founding generation had said, which is, we're independent, we got to remain independent, we got to keep Great Britain out, we got to keep the French out, we got to keep the Spanish out, and we're only worried about this little area that is the United States. What John Quincy Adams is saying is that we're concerned about this little area, but we're concerned about what's southward in Mexico. We're concerned about what's even further southward in South America. We're concerned about what's northward in Canada. Those are all areas that reflect American, United States interests. So it creates an externally oriented foreign policy. Now, the last thing we need to talk about before I let you out of this particular quote lecture is those three key Supreme Court cases that deal with the underpinnings of capitalism. The first one is McCulloch versus Maryland. McCulloch versus Maryland, the state of Maryland had a governor and a legislature that, generally speaking, opposed the Bank of the United States. So what they did is they passed a law in Maryland that taxed any bank operating in Maryland that was chartered outside of Maryland. Now, while the wording of that sounds like, oh, well, that doesn't mean anybody, there was literally only one bank in Maryland that was operating that was chartered outside of Maryland, and that was the Bank of the United States. So it was pretty clear this was aimed at the Bank of the United States. What John Marshall, the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, ruled is that essentially Maryland is challenging whether the Bank of the United States is legitimate. And Marshall says it is. It's legitimate under the necessary and proper clause. And rather than just kind of saying that, we're going to do what Hamilton had always said, Marshall focused on that word necessary. He says the bank is a necessary institution. Therefore, the Congress is allowed to create it. And you in Maryland don't have to like it, but it's here to stay. And then he also turns to the supremacy clause and says that the power to tax includes the power to destroy, and says you can't do that. A state law cannot function to destroy a federal institution. So it reinforces the supremacy clause that all laws and treaties, etc., made by this Constitution are the supreme law of the land. The ruling in McCulloch versus Maryland reinforces that supremacy clause. The case of Dartmouth versus Woodward was about the importance of contracts. Dartmouth College, located in New Hampshire, was created under a private charter in 1767 granted by the King of England. And when the United States declared independence and won its independence, that charter just became a national charter here in the United States. So it was simply, rewritten so that it was still a private institution, but it was privately created under state law in New Hampshire. By 1819, people in New Hampshire were concluding, we want a public college in the state of New Hampshire, but what we don't want to do is spend the money to create this state college, meaning we don't want to go out and hire new faculty, buy land, put new buildings up. They thought the easiest way to accomplish this was to simply turn Dartmouth College into a public college. Now, the Board of Trustees at Dartmouth voted against this. The governor of the state of New Hampshire, however, began packing the Board of Trustees with allies of his who would actually vote for this public option. And during a meeting of the Board of Trustees where there was not a quorum, therefore the vote was not legal, the Board of Trustees got together and voted to turn Dartmouth into a public college. So the remainder of the board got together and sued the state of New Hampshire, and the Supreme Court ruled that a state like New Hampshire cannot unilaterally impair a contract. So it upheld that provision about the importance of contracts in the Constitution. Now, how this relates to capitalism, this is about the creation of a public university versus maintaining it as a private university. But it's about, does a contract mean what's written in the contract? Can one side simply say, we're throwing this out and we're starting over? And what the Supreme Court ruled is, no, they can't. Both parties have to agree to it. So the importance of contracts and the sanctity of contracts, as it's called, is upheld in this decision. The last case is the case of Gibbons versus Ogden, and the question revolved around who has the power to manage commerce in places like New York. Now, the New York State had given the power to two steamboat companies to operate steamships on New York waterways. So only basically two guys controlled who operates. Now, Aaron Ogden and Thomas Gibbons, who were both from operating in New Jersey at that point, went into business together, and they procured a license from these two guys in New York. And they procured a license to operate on the Hudson River, which is literally the boundary between New York and New Jersey. Now, as these things go, Gibbons and Ogden's partnership fell apart, and Gibbons purchased a license from the United States government. After this partnership fell apart, Gibbons buys a license from the U.S. government to operate a steamship. Ogden sued, or in a court called the Chancery Courts in New York, sued Ogden, arguing that no, I have the original contract, only I can operate this steamship. So, very simply, Thomas Gibbons sued Aaron Ogden, and Thomas Gibbons' attorney argued that the laws that allowed the two guys in New York to determine who runs steamships, it was not something that was in force on the Hudson River. If a waterway in New York only was in question, then obviously the state of New York can do that. But since everything that happens on the Hudson River is interstate commerce, only the national government, only the Congress can manage that, and the Supreme Court agreed. So these three cases reflected the importance of capitalism and wound up protecting and supporting the institution of capitalism in the United States. Thanks for hanging with me. I know this was a longer lecture than usual. Hopefully you stuck with it, and I'll see you in the next lecture, lecture 11 on the Great Awakening.